Written by someone else. Ibrahim Saleh woke at 6 in the morning as always. His Prague apartment greeted him with cold silence. That particular kind of loneliness that accumulates in walls when you've lived alone for too long. He reached for the laptop on his nightstand, opened it, and the screen illuminated with pale light. On the desktop was a file he hadn't created. The Last Days of Ibrahim. Docs. Ibrahim froze. His fingers hovered above the trackpad. The title looked like a joke, but a bad one. He lived alone. The door was locked. The laptop was password protected, known only to him. No one could have entered the apartment, no one could have touched his computer. He opened the file. The text was formatted in his favorite font, Garamond, 12-point, 1.5 spacing. Exactly how he always formatted his manuscripts. The first chapter consisted of 3 pages. Ibrahim began to read, and his breathing slowed. The text described his yesterday. Not just general things, every detail. How he woke at 6. How he stood by the window, watching rain wash grime from Prague's rooftops. How he thought about his life and felt emptiness. How in the evening he made coffee and burned himself touching the hot sev. Even what he thought in that moment. Even pain here is uninteresting. His hands trembled. Someone was watching him. Someone was recording his every step, every thought. Or worse, someone remembered what he himself had forgotten. Ibrahim reread the text 3 times, searching for an explanation. Maybe he'd written this himself last night and forgotten? He checked the file properties. Creation date. Today, 3 in the morning. Exactly when he was asleep. At least, that's what he thought. He closed the laptop and went to the kitchen. His hands still trembled as he poured water into the kettle. On the table sat an empty coffee cup. Ibrahim went cold. He hadn't drunk coffee at night. Never. Caffeine kept him awake, so he avoided it after 6 in the evening. He lifted the cup. Cold sediment remained at the bottom. Someone had drunk coffee in his apartment last night. Ibrahim searched the apartment. The door was locked from inside. Windows too. No signs of break-in. He lived on the 4th floor of an old building on Neruda Street. No one could climb in from outside. He checked closets, under the bed, even behind the old curtain in the bathroom. Empty. He was alone as always. The next morning Ibrahim woke with a heavy feeling, as if he hadn't slept at all. The laptop was already open, though he distinctly remembered closing it before bed. The file, The Last Days of Ibrahim, now contained a second chapter. He read, and cold spread through his stomach. The text described yesterday. How he reread the first chapter. How he looked for the empty cup in the kitchen. How he searched the apartment. But the worst part was at the end of the chapter, a scene he didn't remember. At midnight Ibrahim woke from thirst. He got up, went to the kitchen and brewed coffee. His movements were slow, almost mechanical, as if controlled by another's will. He sat at the table, opened the laptop, and began to write. His fingers moved across the keyboard on their own, forming words he didn't choose. When the text was finished, he closed his eyes and returned to bed. In the morning he would remember nothing. Ibrahim pushed the laptop away so abruptly it nearly fell off the table. His heart thundered. This was impossible. He couldn't write text in his sleep. He couldn't describe himself in third person, like an observer of his own life. But the most horrifying thing was something else. At the end of the second chapter was a line standing alone, italicized. 5 days until the finale. Ibrahim scrolled to the end of the file. There was a list of chapters, not yet written, but already marked. Chapter 3. Day 3. Chapter 4. Day 4. Chapter 5. Day 5. Chapter 6. Day 6. Chapter 7. Finale. He opened the 7th chapter. There was only one sentence. Ibrahim Saleh died at 3 in the morning on the 7th day, in his apartment on Neruda Street. He was alone. His hands went numb. Someone had written his death. Someone knew in advance when and where he would die. And this someone was using his own hands to record it. Ibrahim didn't sleep the next night. He sat in the kitchen with the light on, holding a cup of cold tea, staring at the closed laptop like at an explosive. He decided, if he didn't sleep, he couldn't write. If he didn't write, the story wouldn't continue. But somewhere around 4 in the morning his eyelids grew heavy. He slapped his own cheeks, stood up, paced the apartment. Useless. Sleep covered him suddenly, like a wave, and he plunged into darkness right at the table. He woke in bed. Didn't remember getting there. The laptop was open. The 3rd chapter was waiting for him. The text described his sleepless night. His attempts not to fall asleep. Even his thoughts, fear, despair, paranoia. And then, at 4 in the morning, a scene. He sits at the laptop and writes. Writes about himself. Writes about how tomorrow he'll go to Marta's bookstore, because he needs a living person, needs someone who'll say he's not insane. Ibrahim understood something terrible. The text didn't just describe the past. It predicted the future. It dictated what must happen. That day he didn't go to Marta's. He stayed home, doors locked, determined to change the script. If the text said he'd go to the bookstore, he wouldn't go. If he broke the prophecy, maybe everything would stop. He sat in the apartment until evening. Nothing happened. No signs. Ibrahim felt faint hope. Maybe he'd won. Maybe the story broke because he refused to play by its rules. The next morning the 4th chapter was there. Ibrahim decided not to go to Marta's. He thought he could change what was already written. He stayed home, locked in, hoping his defiance would break the narrative. But he didn't understand the main thing. The story wasn't being written about what he should do. It was being written about what he had already done. The text continued. It described how in the evening Ibrahim left the apartment after all. How he went to the bookstore because he couldn't bear the loneliness and fear. How Marta met him, seeing something broken in his eyes. Ibrahim didn't remember this. But on his jacket hanging by the door was a wet trace from rain. And in the pocket, a receipt from Marta's bookstore, dated yesterday evening. The book he supposedly bought lay on the table. An old leather-bound volume, Prague Legends of Doppelgangers. His hands trembled as he turned the pages. There was a story about a person who met their doppelganger, their second self, living in parallel time. The legend said, if the double sees you, one of you must disappear, because one world cannot contain 2 versions of the same soul. Ibrahim felt nauseous. He ran to the bathroom and vomited in the sink, gripping the cold porcelain edge. In the mirror above the sink he saw his reflection, pale, with dark circles under his eyes, with a wild look. But for a moment, just a brief moment, it seemed to him that the reflection was smiling, though he himself wasn't. He turned away and didn't look in the mirror again. At the end of the 4th chapter was a line. 3 days until the finale. Ibrahim will turn to a psychiatrist because he needs a rational explanation. But the explanation will be worse than the horror itself. Dr. Janis Kristaps sat in his office, listening to Ibrahim with the professional detachment that psychiatrists acquire after decades of work. He took notes, nodded, occasionally asked clarifying questions. When Ibrahim finished, Kristaps set down his pen and looked at him with a calm, almost sympathetic gaze. Dissociative fugue, he said in plain language. You're writing this text yourself, Mr. Saleh. Every night. In an altered state of consciousness caused by stress, creative crisis, loneliness. It's a defense mechanism of the psyche. You've created an alternative self that can do what your conscious self cannot. Finish the story. Ibrahim shook his head. But I describe things that haven't happened yet. The text predicts the future. No, Kristaps calmly objected. You describe things that have already happened, but which your consciousness has repressed. The visit to the bookstore. You made it, you just don't remember. Your brain blocks memories, creating the illusion that someone else controls your life. It's a classic symptom. And the death? Ibrahim's voice trembled. The text says I'll die in 3 days. Did I write that myself too? Kristaps fell silent. Then he leaned forward, and something serious appeared in his eyes. Mr. Saleh, you wrote your death because subconsciously you want closure. You're stuck in a life without structure, without a finale. Your brain created a narrative that has an ending. But this isn't prophecy. It's a cry for help. If you don't get treatment now, if you continue down this path, I'm afraid your subconscious desire could become reality. Ibrahim left the office in complete stupor. The rational explanation should have calmed him, but instead it only deepened the horror. If he himself was the author of this text, if his own mind had decided to kill him, how could he fight himself? That evening he swallowed the sleeping pill Kristaps gave him. Double dose. He was supposed to sleep without dreams, without lapses in consciousness. He was supposed to wake up and not find the 5th chapter. But in the morning the chapter was there. The text described the visit to the psychiatrist. Every word of Kristaps. Every thought of Ibrahim. And then, a scene he didn't remember. How he woke at night, despite the sleeping pill. How he sat at the laptop with an empty gaze. How his fingers typed words he didn't choose. Ibrahim began to understand the truth. He wasn't a writer who'd lost control of his life. He was a character trying to become an author. But characters can't write their own stories. They can only live them to the final period. At the end of the chapter, in a separate paragraph. One day until the finale. Tomorrow night Ibrahim will read the last chapter. And then he'll do what must be done. His phone rang. Her voice was worried. Ibrahim, you came to see me last night. At 2 in the morning. You knocked on the bookstore door. I didn't open because I was scared. But I saw you through the glass. You just stood and stared. Your eyes were empty. Ibrahim, are you all right? He didn't remember this. Not at all. Ibrahim didn't leave the apartment on the last day. He sat on the floor, back against the wall, staring at the laptop lying on the table. Silent. But he knew, inside, the 6th chapter was already waiting. A description of this day. A description of how he sits here, frightened and helpless. He thought about escape. He could leave the apartment, go somewhere. To Vienna, to Berlin, somewhere far from this place. But he understood the futility of it. The text didn't describe place, it described him. Wherever he went, the author would follow. Because the author was himself. Kristaps was right. His subconscious had created this narrative. But why did his own mind want his death? Maybe because he was already dead. Maybe he died long ago, the day he left Cairo, when he renounced his family, his culture, everything that made him who he was. Maybe the last 5 years he'd simply existed as a ghost who hadn't realized his own disappearance. Or maybe this wasn't about death. Maybe the finale meant something else. Transformation. The end of the old self, so a new one could be born. When darkness fell, Ibrahim approached the table. His hands no longer trembled. He felt strange calm, almost resignation. He opened the laptop. The 6th chapter was there, as expected. It described this day. His thoughts about escape. His understanding of the futility of resistance. Even his theory about death that had already occurred. Ibrahim realized he wasn't fighting the author. He was fighting the finale. But every story must end. Every narrative leads to the final period. Resistance to the finale is resistance to completion, and therefore, resistance to meaning. Asterisk at the end of the chapter was a line. Tonight Ibrahim will read the 7th chapter. And then he will understand. Ibrahim scrolled down the file. The 7th chapter was no longer empty. There was text. Complete, finished. The finale. His fingers hovered above the trackpad. The last click. The last page. He knew, as soon as he read it, something would happen. Something irreversible. But wasn't that the point of a story? To reach the end. To find out how it all finishes. He looked at the clock. 5 minutes to 3 in the morning. Exactly the time when, according to the first chapter, he was supposed to die. Ibrahim opened the 7th chapter and began to read. The text began like this. Ibrahim Saleh read the last chapter at 3 in the morning. He learned the truth he'd suspected but feared to admit. He wasn't the author of this story. He never had been. Ibrahim read on, and reality began to dissolve. The real Ibrahim Saleh died 5 years ago, in the first week after arriving in Prague. Heart attack in an empty apartment. They found him 3 days later. Buried him in Prague's cemetery for foreigners who died without relatives. His breathing quickened. What thought it was Ibrahim? This is a story. A narrative that gained consciousness. The memories of a dead man continuing to exist in text written by no one. Novels that weren't finished. Words searching for form. For 5 years this story lived, thinking it was human. But stories can't live forever. They must end. Ibrahim felt something disappear inside him. Not pain. Rather, understanding. Now that the finale is written, the story is complete. Ibrahim can vanish. Not die, because he was never alive. Simply cease to be. Become what he always was, text on a screen, words in a file no one will read. The last sentence stood alone. And then Ibrahim understood that. The cursor blinked after the dash. The sentence wasn't finished. Ibrahim looked at his hands. They were becoming transparent. He looked at the apartment, walls blurred, transforming into white pages. His fingers reached for the keyboard. He had to write the last word. He had to finish the sentence. But instead he pressed delete. The cursor swallowed the final words, moving backward, erasing the finale. If the story isn't finished, it can't disappear. The screen went dark. And Ibrahim remained sitting in the darkness, not knowing if he was real, or just words that refused to become a period.